Hello, my name is Edwin Kumasaru. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Edinburgh, and along with Dr. Rachel Warriner, co-convener of the Courtaulds Gender and Sexuality Research Group. I'm really thrilled this evening. We've got a fantastic speaker. It's a real honour and a privilege to welcome Adham Faramawy for a lecture on queer ecologies in their artistic practice. Before I introduce Adham properly, and Adham will speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we can have some questions. Please do post your questions in the chat, by the way, and feel free to do that throughout or at the end. But anyway, before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd just like to say a few words on the theme for tonight's lecture. We live in a warming planet at a time of rising fascism, with hardening borders, imperial violence, and attacks on LGBTQ people. Following the 2007 to 8 financial crash, a decade of government austerity, and waves of economic crisis, feminist, queer, anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist movements have surged in recent years. Adham's work speaks to the interconnections between climate, queer politics, and colonial legacies. And if these systems of oppression have long been interconnected, so too have the struggles against them. As Silvia Federici points out in her book, Caliban and the Witch, the beginnings of capitalism were marked by the enclosure of common land in Europe, the enslavement of African people, the start of European imperialism, the outlawing of non-procreative sexualities, and the persecution of pagan belief systems through witch hunts. In England, what was then known as buggery was outlawed in 1533, the country's first civil sodomy law. In later centuries, social understandings of sexuality shifted from an act to an identity. Alongside and underpinning these changes, developed a notion that gender was a binary, despite a long history of resistance. As European imperialism stole resources and perpetuated violence, colonial laws governed sexuality and gender, while administrators tried to suppress indigenous belief systems connected to the land. Close or spiritual relationships to the environment were seen as a threat to extractive capitalism. Oppression in Europe and its empires were organized and regulated through social categories, conceptualized as natural or unnatural. Such a global system was, and still is, met with implicit or explicit resistance, whether it be anti-colonial movements, non-normative genders and sexualities, or indigenous ecologies. While certain empires formally ended in the 20th century, they continue to shape the world, managing unequal distributions of wealth and debt, from tax havens to military interventions, as well as restricting access to the spoils by hostile environments for immigrants. If Adham's work is attentive to and protests against the violence of borders, and borders in the most expansive sense, they also practice a kind of enchanted knowledge, entangled between British and Egyptian landscapes, animating deep histories of resistance and imagining possible worlds. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker tonight. Adham is an artist of Egyptian descent based in London. They have been shortlisted for the 2021 and 2017 Jarman Award. Adham has recently exhibited in group shows at Somerset House and the Science Gallery, as well as Art Night in 2021. In 2019, the artists presented Skinflick at a screening dedicated to their work at Tate Britain. Adham was a 2018-19 fellow at Broadway's Near Now and has had solo exhibitions at Sail Projects and the Blue Coat. So without further ado, it's wonderful to have Adham here this evening.
Hi everyone. Hi, I'm Adham Faramawy. Thanks very much, Edwin, for that really nice introduction and for inviting me to be here, and for Courtauld for hosting this. And I guess I'll get started. I'm an artist. I have worked across a really wide variety of media. I've made computer programs, I've made an app, I've made perfume, I've made prints, but most of my work revolves around performance for camera videos that I often install as part of sculptural assemblages. And in the last few years, I've been making video works that move between biological or etymological histories to more personal histories or fictions, I guess to try and find some context for myself. So to, you know, make a bit of space to breathe and to think and to consider the ways that I've been able to navigate or move through the world. And my research centers the body. I like this idea of the body as a starting point, you know, a place to begin. And performance and movement feel like a really direct way to instigate discourses and discussion around bodies and lived experience. And I've drawn on ideas and images of porous bodies in science fiction to explore how different species get tangled up in each other's lives, like describing the different relationships people have had with, say, a flower, you know, how it's named, how it's thought of, how it's used, to examine stories of migration and interrogate my own desires, thinking through the different ways a body, a behavior, a movement or an interaction might be desirable and when it or they might be unwelcome. In 2019, I made a video work called Skinflick, which premiered at a screening dedicated to my work at Tate Britain, which I later developed into a series of sculptural iterations. Actually, I'm just going to share my screen to see if I can show that. Maybe not. Hold on one sec. There we go. Skinflick, I guess, marked a shift in the practice. It's a very personal work, and making this video for me was a way to explore my experiences of intimacy and of desire as a queer migrant body living in a European country with a colonial history that really shapes its present situation. You know, being a body is complicated, and the work is so much about tracing this tangle of experiences and events, some of which just contradict each other. I offered the phrase skinflick with a lightness of touch, and hopefully with a bit of humor, you know, the skinflick as pornographic movie, the flick of the skin as a sensual gesture, and a sensation, you know, and using ointments and bodily fluids and Pepsi and soil and toxins and contaminants to test the body's boundaries as a site of the political, you know, as a border, as a margin, as a point of interface. And I guess the work ended up exploring or butting up against some of the complexity of my own experience living in the UK at a sensitive political moment of redressing racial tensions, leaving the EU, and the crackdown on political borders and boundaries. And I drew from a lot of different places to produce this work. Personal anecdotes and experiences, mythology, the taxonomy and migration stories of plants and other non-human life. And actually, I recently received a really lovely essay including thoughts on Skinflick by an American author and scholar called Sophie Lewis. And mostly Sophie focused on the role of the mythological figure of Daphne and her metamorphosis into a laurel tree, where the video is described as, wait, I'm just going to read this. An ecosexual porno movie, if we understand eros in terms of liveliness, a state teeming with life, then we can perhaps summarize the buried crux of the metamorphosis as follows. It is the moment when a bombshell desires not to be beautiful and becomes quasi-accidentally hot. And I think that this is quite a wonderful reading, partly for the use of the word bombshell to describe Daphne, and partly because it reminds me of, there's this short nature series where Isabella Rossellini, dressed in cardboard costume, dramatizes the sex life of snails. And maybe more directly, I enjoyed this description because I wanted to share an image of the body as something, as the possibility of the body as something beyond beauty as commodity. It feels like Sophie's essay makes space to question hotness, to question desire, to question belonging. And it makes space to question what it is to be a body in relation to other bodies. You know, do our bodies really end at the skin, or do we extend out into our environments through bacteria and through touch? And this idea or image or way of thinking about the body as something more porous, particularly in relation to intimacy, became more important during the pandemic, and the overlaps between language that deals with biology and language that describes cultural values seems to have become even more entangled and sticky. You know, how we describe something can and does have real world implications and effects. And actually, this image of the porosity of the body is heavily indebted to Octavia Butler and her third gender characters, the Ooloi from Lillis Brood. Lillis Brood is a trilogy of books that describes characters, mainly the African-American protagonist Lilith, named after the biblical first wife of Adam and the mother of monsters, waking up in an unfamiliar world, you know, forced to come to terms with these unexpected biological processes caused by a forced integration with an alien race after an apocalyptic, earth-shattering war. And essentially, the alien Oankali want to procreate and become hybrid with humans through a third gendered mate, the Ooloi, who would join a male-female couple, extending these fine tendrils into both partners' bodies, tasting them through the mycelia, and simultaneously healing them at a cellular level and generating and enjoying a pleasurable coital hallucination. And this series of books was really important for me, actually. You know, they gave me a bit of support or space, and they kind of got me through the healing process after a road accident where my body behaved in some unexpected and sometimes really disgusting ways. But also it was really incredibly useful to read Butler using this story to think about issues of gender and consent, to consider the transatlantic slave trade and its legacies, and also to propose a relationship between a toxic hierarchical masculinity and our approach to ecology. You know, I found something so profoundly queer and nourishing in the image of a non-binary fungal sexuality. And it's honestly been a foundational image for me. You know, as I say in this video, I wish my desires were more vegetal. I'm just gonna swap videos. Okay, so as I mentioned, Skinflick marked a shift for me, and I wanted to explore my own experiences by figuring out how to describe things, by telling stories in my own voice. So I started scripting for the videos, which I always planned to be both part of sculptural assemblages like this one at the Science Gallery in London, and more recently I've done another version of this for another group show at the Bemis Center in Nebraska. And yeah, I mean, I see these kinds of sculptural assemblages as a bodily and material viewing experience. But I also wanted to, or I always planned to show these works as durational viewing experiences that would be watched from start to finish in, say, a cinema or as a single channel projection, or often online. And this meant that text and textual reference started playing a bigger part in how I made my work. You know, I've always enjoyed reading sci-fi and poetry and comics and some theory, but actually I've got maybe a certain level of animosity or suspicion when I'm reading more academic writing. For me, theory needs to maintain a direct relationship with lived experience and provide tools for navigating real world events or problems, or I kind of find myself veering away from it. Having said that, I drew heavily on the works of Catriona Sandilands, the academic who coined the term queer ecologies, particularly her talk Botanically Queer. I enjoyed Astrida Nimanis's Composting Feminisms, poet Marwa Helal's book Invasive Species, and Nisha Ramaya's States of the Body Produced by Love. Both Nisha Ramaya and Marwa Helal's anthologies shared writing that offered me ways to think through my cultural and bodily experiences, and also shared some thoughts on how culture and ideology can manifest in some materially quite violent ways. In one poem, Marwa Helal, who is Egyptian American, describes the visa application process in the American embassy in Cairo while she's trying to apply for American citizenship. And this is, you know, an experience of the absurdity and violence of both American and Egyptian bureaucratic processes that I recognized. The poem echoed my own experiences of the difficulty of traveling across political borders, you know, of simply moving between one place and another as an Arab, and particularly within Europe or to America, but also my experiences verifying my status for Egyptian military conscription, which was humiliating and terrifying in equal measure. And Hillel also included multiple texts on different species that found their ways to North America, like the common carp in Illinois, and how they affect ecosystems there. So I kept going back to this writing and this way of processing bureaucracy through metaphor, and it helped me through. It was something to do, I think, with positioning yourself in relation to, and if I'm honest, I can't totally unpack that, because I think it's as simple as that. It's about how you sit in relation to other people and to stories, to histories, you know, how you find a precedent for yourself and your experiences. And, you know, I recognize some of my own experiences as a migrant in Britain. And actually some of Banu Kapil's writing does this for me also, particularly the book, How to Wash a Heart, which offered me these really rare and sublime moments of recognition where you see yourself in the text. Excuse me. Language for me has been a way to map out the space between experience and mediation, between the thing and its description. Language is slippery. It's a site of slippage and instability. And instability is important and it's useful. It provides that little bit of space to ask questions about ways of being, you know, ways of moving through the world. And often these ways that we move through the world are understood as natural, when actually they could or should be understood as cultural, as a choice. Whether that choice was made by me or someone else, you know, is still a question at stake. And actually, animation has been another way for me to question or prod the stability of the image, and so the stability of coding a body. Looking at how we answer the question, you know, what is that? I've worked a lot with animation and virtual effects. And in the last few years, it's become really useful to animate some of the plants that feature in the work, as well as insects, fungi, and mold. And I tend to subscribe to this idea of animation as a macabre practice of animating non-living, copying, simulating, pretending to be alive, the cartoon as a kind of zombie. And I animate some plants while filming others. And it's been an interesting exercise, I guess, in denaturalizing. I want for us to be able to look closely at the ways these plants live, cohabit, and romance. In Botanically Queer, Catriona Sandilands talks very candidly about the ways that plants and other species' reproductive practices don't adhere to human social and sexual norms, and how looking more closely at some of the other species we share the planet with can serve to denaturalize some of our own thinking and social expectations around sex and gender, which are really so central to the concerns in Skinflick. So, as I said, Skinflick was made at the end of 2019. And, that's when the pandemic actually hit and a lot of stuff changed. And by the summer of 2020, I had started work on a piece titled The Air is Subtle, Various and Sweet, which I shot with 2 dancers in the Wanstead Flats Nature Reserve near my home in East London. And then while developing it, I was invited to participate in an online symposium for serpentine ecologies about soil. And that was called The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, the understory of the understory. And so I made a preliminary version of the work, which privileged audio, with the understanding that I would further develop the video and then produce a sculptural iteration of the work. And The Air is Subtle was, to say the least, a challenging work to make. 2020 was a chaotic year for many of us in a variety of ways, and it's hard to talk about this video outside of the circumstances that produced it. Like for almost everyone, the pandemic sharpened some of my, I guess some of the pressures in my life. When lockdown hit, most of my work was postponed or cancelled. My flatmate moved out immediately, so I ended up spending most of the year without human contact, which was a trip. I got into some very public racialized fights with institutions that I've worked with, not least for my teaching work at university, which pays my bills. And this was at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, which led to a lot of institutions asking for me to work on public-facing statements on racism for free, most of which haven't been followed up on since. And during all of this, my father passed away. I wasn't able to go to his funeral in Egypt, and actually I watched an online wake some of his friends and colleagues streamed on YouTube, which I sat through after a very long and really quite racist meeting for a charity that I'd been working for. So actually, in a lot of ways, this video became central to my grieving process. It was a way for me to think through my complex relationship with my father by considering our different relationships to land and to place. My dad was an artist, a political cartoonist for 40 years, a musician. He wrote plays, he acted, and he presented a couple of TV shows, one of which I use in the video. He was conscripted to the Egyptian army, and as I mentioned, I wasn't. He drove a tank for a while, and he was a history teacher after university for a few years. So he was, an interesting character and very much a performer. And through all of his public work, he really foregrounded his falahi, meaning working class rural roots and upbringing. It was really important to him to champion that part of himself. He was, as far as I know, the first person to go to university in his family. His parents, my paternal grandparents, were illiterate. And though our relationship was complicated, this aspect of his character especially was something that I treasured. Both my parents' socialism and social awareness have shaped the ways I navigate my life living in England. I might just quickly share. Subtle. Okay. So the Aristotle Various and Sweet is actually a quote from Ursula Le Guin's sci-fi novel, The Word for World is Forest. That novel was a breath of fresh air in a very rough moment, and it encouraged me to look closer at the plants around me. One of the plants was Scotch broom, which in the video introduces, actually you can see it there in the background, in the video it introduces this really bodily narrative through its medicinal uses associated with blood, and also, and actually this is true of many of the plants in the work, their colonial histories through migratory patterns and esoteric or folkloric associations and gender oppression, thinking about how Scotch broom was burned to stop witches in Italy. I also filmed a marshmallow plant at the edge of a car park by the roadside that leads into the Wanstead Flats. And the research really surprised me because in looking at the etymology of its Latin name, Malva parviflora, it shifts relations with the body. It reveals these associations with softness, with softening, with rottenness, putrefaction, with slime, and also in cooking, how it can be used to make this thick mucousy broth, which reminded me a lot of Egyptian foods like okra or molokhia, which are both delicious, but actually can also be pretty slimy. This section of the film also serves to draw us backwards historically in discovering the marshmallow's uses as an aphrodisiac in ancient Greece, and that in ancient Egyptian lore, the sap from the roots of the common mallow would be served with honey as a sweet. And so it kind of behaves as a narrative transition leading us from East London to Egypt via these ancient Egyptian confections. And the marshmallow in the car park segues us into this dream about my dad's flat in his hometown of Tours, which was actually a real dream that I had. But in the video, it introduces him and our relationship. Also his relationship to material and to history and to human touch, which leads into a segment of a television show about my dad presented. Actually, let me just move forward a little bit so that you can see him. So yeah, this is a segment of a television show my dad presented called My Relationship with a Place, where he tours his neighborhood. He describes where he grew up and the conditions they lived in, how he started drawing on the walls of the neighbors' houses using charcoal from the local bakery, slipping from this really warm but quite factual description into poetry, where he uses this really rich and idiosyncratic language. And this was one of the ways that my dad foregrounded his heritage. It was in his use of language. Traditionally, poetry might be written in classical Arabic, but here he not only speaks colloquially, but he mixes formal sentence structures with very, very rich local vocabulary. Honestly, translating his words was a labor of love. I didn't feel like I could ask someone outside the family to work on it. So I actually asked my sister to do the translation with me. My language isn't anywhere near strong enough for translation. And I didn't really feel like I could send this material to a translator I didn't know. My weak vocabulary in Arabic has always felt like a bit of a barrier for me. But my sister is a journalist and a translator like my mum. So we were able to work on this together, and her proximity, you know, her closeness to the material, to our dad's words, felt so direct. And it was really good to do this together. We actually ended up working a fair bit on research together for this piece, and my mum did a bit of the copy editing. My dad's relationship to his heritage felt so certain and so stable. But in the video, it's framed very much through class struggle, and that his education and his art, whether in drawing satirical cartoons, painting, sculpting, poetry or music, was the product, yes, of innate ability, but also, to me, it was the product of a socialist moment with free education that allowed him access. So he met my mum through journalism, and actually she was the first woman in her family to get a degree. And journalism allowed them both to travel for work and led to me being born in the Emirates and growing up mostly here in England, which has produced arguably a much more unstable relationship to place. But I was really grateful to be able to start articulating the complexity of the relationship. And although this work only brushes the surface in a lot of ways, I'm really grateful to be able to present a migration story with a little bit of nuance. Let's stop sharing that. Okay. After the Aristotle, Various and Sweets, I made a work called The Heart Wants What the Heart Wants. Initially, this work was going to be a live performance for an annual event called Art Night, which was supposed to take place in 2020, and it was supposed to happen around the Strand. I did site visits at Somerset House, where the Courtauld located, and at King's College next door. Eventually, we settled on a space in 180 Strand nearby. Then COVID happened and the event was postponed, then it went online. So the work became a performance for camera video for the online iteration of Art Night 2021. It also screened on a streaming service called Share, which focuses on the work of filmmakers from North Africa and Southwest Asia. And this work extended, deepened, and to some degree began to interrogate the concerns set out in the Aristotle, Various and Sweet. I'm just going to share the screen again. Okay. So, The Heart Wants What the Heart Wants was also shot on the Wanstead Flats. And I approached thinking about the marginalized communities that I belong to, and also the communities that I live alongside but don't belong to. But this time I focus very much on my experiences of the intersection of race as a migrant and gender as a somewhat non-conforming person, drawing more directly on Arab and Egyptian practices, languages and plants. And in a way, it was a development of the thinking that produced Skinflick, and 2 years later, featured the return of the monstrous narrator, with me delivering sections of the monologue on screen and prosthetic makeup, shot in a park. And for me, this was a way of oversharing by speaking through and about characters. I was really forthright in scripting this video. I drew on some really very personal experiences and family histories, and I felt quite ill at ease with the shape of the story. I felt exposed, and I felt a bit self-obsessed in the number of times that I said, I this or I that. And I took the script to a good friend and artist, Safia Al-Marriya, and they reminded me of the seminal queer novel Fox and Their Friends Between Revolutions, and the way that so many of the characters were, much like in the radical fairy community, named after animals, plants and flowers. And they reminded me of how many stories of herbs, flowers and non-human actors were in the video, and showed me how moving from first person to third person could make enough space for me to talk about delicate subjects. So I became chamomile and cespen and dragonwort and blue lotus. And though I don't make it explicit in the video, These are all flowers and herbs used in ancient Egyptian funerary rites, some native, some migrant through trade with Asia Minor, which is the contemporary Levant, Palestine and southern Turkey, extending this spectre of mourning and of loss and of grief from previous works. And this image of migration, or the figure of the migrant, overlaps in interesting ways with ideas and images of purity, and, you know, by extension, toxicity. I guess with what belongs where and why, you know? This line of questioning has been really useful for me to unpick, I guess, the ways and the reasons we name and codify, ultimately to further destabilize, because honestly, I'm not afforded stability. I'll show a few more sections of this. Okay, let's change video. Right, so toxicity. Toxicity is an interesting word. I feel like it was very present in my show at Niruratnam Gallery, which is the documentation that you can see right now. And this is where I first presented a sculptural iteration of the Aristotle Variously Sweet. And I tried to draw on my dad's position in relation to material, to collecting, to bricolage and assemblage. He was someone that collected garbage and ephemera that had evidence of usage and of the human hand. And for him, this made things valuable. His approach to collecting stuff, detritus, 7-Up bottle from the 70s, his mother's metal laundry basin that he painted on, somehow shifts and complexifies how I think about waste and pollution. Anisha Ramaya wrote a text in response to my work, which was influenced and informed by her writing, and read it to preface a conversation I had with Serpentine curator Kostas Stasnopoulos at the Whitechapel Gallery late last year. And Nisha read, "Begin with Kamala, lotus flower, the 10th Mahavidya. Hail Lakshmi, the good sign. Gaja Lakshmi, elephantine fortune. Amarta, one who is not dead. Nectar, residue of the sacrifice. She is the antidote to poison. She is the poison itself. She is the poison, state-sanctioned document, honorific prefix. Holding a lotus, she rose to the top. She is the poison, foaming progress, betray, profane, rosy or safflower dominion. She is the poison, 4 white elephants conferring immortality, produced at the churning of the ocean. This is not where I want to begin." And I read that with real gratitude to Nisha, because I'm quite a fan. And I find all of these images, figures, and symbols really quite intoxicating. I've said of this text before that it feels like the thing and its representation existing in the same space. And that to some degree, I think that we share this way of articulating the diasporic experience through complexity, through complex configurations of images and sensations. And I got excited looking at how we become tangled up in, I guess, each other's lives. And there's this feeling that toxicity is maybe through proximity relative to infection, an unwelcome closeness, you know, to a breach of the skin, of borders, of boundaries. And that's interesting to me, that there can be a relationship or an overlap between the biological and the cultural in so much mess and without resolution. A couple of years ago, I made friends with someone who taught me about fermentation processes, about the microbiome on the skin and in the gut, and how eating fermented foods can be so beneficial to maintaining healthy gut flora. And we talked about how so much of our bodies are made up of bacteria, you know, of non-human DNA, and how somehow apart from, I don't know, being kind of gross, this really loosened or undid my ideas of my body ending at the skin. And it showed me that maybe we do in fact extend out into the environments that we live in, and that we do, you know, comprise each other in some ways. But there is a threat of disease here, of decay. And these ideas, images and logics of dirtiness and threats are qualities that are ascribed both to the figure of the migrant and the homosexual. Toxicity and toxic embodiment have become really important to me. After so many years thinking about touch and how mediating images of the body might affect how I think about or understand touch and embodiment, toxic embodiment as a field of inquiry adds existential concerns around health and the environment to this more established philosophical thinking around embodied experience and phenomenology. So, you know, the relationship between an actual experience and its representation in either language or image. And that's really useful, you know, when you're trying to articulate any experience lived through the climate collapse, where it's become, I'm sorry, I got frustrated, I'm confused by the screen is doing something. Okay, so this issue of living through the climate collapse, where it's become so vital to reassess how we inhabit, live with, deal with our environments and the other species we cohabit with, you know, how we actively cope with and try to stave off climate collapse. But also, and this stems from the thinking of Catriona Sandilands, Maru Helel, and Astrida Nemanis, how looking closely at other species can affect how I understand my own body, and how so often the language around classification and taxonomy, whether say a plant is ornamental or a weed, native or invasive, this language is used to describe people and communities also. And that's resulted in fundamentally wrong and materially damaging and violent practices and policies, from Section 8 to the current incredibly messy and willfully cruel Nationality and Borders Bill, which, you know, affects the resettlement of those fleeing war and traveling to Europe as refugees. And particularly when we see the stark difference in response, both socially and in government rhetoric, if not in action, to refugees traveling within Europe and the Room for Refugees initiative. And I explored this issue in my most recent video. Actually, I'm just going to show that. So the video, A Proposal for a Parakeet's Garden, was exhibited at Goldsmiths CCA in the group show Testament, where I described the story of the migration of the London parakeet as a way to open up conversation around attitudes to migration more generally, and generate some financial support for a refugee charity, actually a number of refugee charities, including the Lewisham Refugee and Migrant Network, by buying my edition print of parakeets from the GCCA website. But actually, please, I'm genuinely mentioning this because I'd like you to go buy one, because all of the money goes to the charity. But I was trying to extend this issue of opening up a dialogue about the violence of bureaucracy through metaphor, through the story of the arrival in England of this bird that's native to the foot of the Himalayas and to West Africa in England as a Victorian pet, you know, and all the stories and mythologies and urban mythologies that surround this this bird, and also, you know, the kinds of toxicities that this bird suffers, you know, understanding it as feral, and the continual calls for culls of this bird, and also some of the genuine and valid ecological concerns about its success in the UK because it's so well adapted to, you know, British climate. So I guess in a lot of ways, my thinking about toxicity, about poison, about pollution, is as much about accepting that we are living through and critically relating to and historically positioning the climate crisis as relative to capitalism and colonialism, and so to white supremacy, as it is trying to tell these personal stories as a way to open up these larger conversations on how we treat each other. And I would like to leave it there and open up for questions if you have any. I'll just stop sharing. Edwin, are you there?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. You spoke so profoundly and beautifully, not just about your work, but also the really complex and often violent entanglement between ecology, capitalism, and histories of empire. And you speak with such a kind of attentive and thoughtful care towards not just the conceptual systems that uphold those forms of oppression, but also the ways in which people and plants or non-humans can draw methods and mechanisms of resistance, and have for centuries. There's such a deep historical consciousness to your work as well, which is layered with this poetry. Just what, wonderfully engaging and compelling. And you speak about it really, really brilliant.
Thank you. That's very kind. I appreciate it.
Please, so someone's already posted their question in the chat. We'll come to that in a second. If there's anyone else, please do post your questions in and I'll read them out. I'll just start. I really loved, there was so much I loved about this talk. I think you had such a detailed and kind of complex understanding of the politics and the kind of the stakes of the images that you're engaging with. And I really loved your description of toxicity and the complexity around it, and the way that there was you were aware of both the metaphorical and the material, and they kind of interwoved in interesting ways. On the one hand, there's the not just the idea of purity and impurity as a structuring tool for like forms of social organization, but also like.
Sorry to interrupt, but it feels like, when we're talking about these things, sometimes, especially in academic spaces, there's this tendency towards abstraction from the source. And actually, for me, it's been really useful to find instances in personal anecdote where these things are experienced live, that like this is something that I've lived through, or a family member or a friend, and I can recount that story and describe how this idea, how an abstraction, like the overlap of this issue of biological and social toxicity can be, lived through, and I don't know, there's been something that's been very rewarding for me personally to find ways to articulate that, but also just in developing tools to navigate it, like how do we get through that? So for example, for me, having an accent like mine, which is from Southern England, growing up in Surrey, I can get through border patrol. My face stops me, but as soon as I click the Queen's English, and my mother's done this. She's it's the only time that I've seen her back down from a fight is at border patrol when we're traveling together, and she says, you deal with this one, anyway, yeah.
What I really wanted to ask you about was the non-binary fungal sexuality that you described in the talk. and the way that it was a kind of foundational image for you. I was wondering if you could say anything about that fungal context or set of ideas or histories or materials.
All right. I mean, it's kind of a personal question. It doesn't sound like it, but it really is. It's a weirdly personal question. So when I was a teenager, all of my, some teenagers have this tendency to cut out pictures from magazines and stick them up on the wall. The people in my pictures were people like Tallulah Bankhead and Bowie, and they were the bisexual bright young things. There were these images of a much more fluid gender presentation and sexual play, and I just found this really exciting, that this idea of a binary, or you have to be this or you have to be that. I'm an Aries. I don't like being told what to do. I want more, I wanted more freedom and choice in this. And actually, when I came across, and there are multiple images of this. I actually did a screening series, a cinematic screening series in 2018-19 called Porous Bodies through Near Now in Nottingham, which explored this image of bodily dissolution and the erotics of bodily dissolution in cinema. And it just offers an opening up, of categories, these ideas, so films like Akira or Paprika or Belladonna of Sadness or the Congress or Videodrome or anything really by Cronenberg, they open up this, through body horror, these possibilities for us. But it's funny, how social categories opening up is so often paired with horror in cinema, like the image of the femme fatale in film noir, that the only image of a feminist presence in a film needs to be met with violence and horror. And it's yeah, anyway, that's kind of what I have to say about that. It just, these images of the tendrils of the ooloi were so close to mushroom mycelia. It just feels, it's a wonderful image for me.
Absolutely.
So biologically impossible also,
Completely. Yeah. Thank you. I think you speak about it so beautifully and so compelling. So there are a couple of questions in the chat. One's from Nelly, who says, "Thanks so much, Adham. Such a beautiful, profound and generous presentation," which is absolutely true. Really wonderful. I'm interested in how you work with, through and about sound/vibration in your practice. Could include touch. Can you speak in relation to metaphor, your experience of migration, identity, culture, body/borders, or anything else you'd like to speak on?
Sound for me, especially in the last couple of years, is about emoting. It's about producing tone and feeling and certain reverberations which don't quite match up. So there are moments of dissonance and discord between what we're seeing. Maybe it's an image of tenderness, or maybe it's something that's quite soft. And then, so for example, I've been using quite a lot of mid-20th century modernist classical music. Essentially, no, but also actually some earlier than that, but Debussy and things like that. But essentially to introduce this formal European mannerism, which so often has been used as a way to impede the progress of the colonial subject. So using those tonal qualities of very formal European classical music, for me, was this way of saying something rigid and something a blockage in some ways, even though actually it's quite a romantic thing. It produces dissonance and discord for me in the videos. And there are, I think in the Aristotle especially, the section with my dad's TV show is all the way through. It's soundtracked with him playing a ney, which is an Egyptian woodwind instrument played like this, just to the corner of the mouth, and he played it a lot, and tabla as well. So it just that felt more resonant for me and more at ease somehow, and melancholy for sure, but less about discord and a space between what you can see and what you can hear. Somehow there's a synthesis in that moment where things become clear. And I don't think that that's because there aren't political issues that need to be unpacked and explored in that space. It's just reiterates the video's production from a diasporic perspective for me, I think, you know, from being outside. But yeah, that's that. But this issue of touch is very much about tenderness, and you know, we weren't really able to do that after Skinflick. We haven't really been able to, you know, I work with dancers very closely on choreography, and sound very much plays a part in structuring the phrases that we work with, that we produce together and work from in an improvisational way. And actually that's been an interesting thing, because we haven't been able to touch for the last couple of years since COVID. So we've had to speak towards, you know, answering questions like, how do you produce intimacy without touch? What does that look like? And actually in these videos, it was synchronicity, asynchronicity, a return to synchronicity, understanding the camera as a proxy for the viewer's body, you know? Anyway, sound.
Fantastic answer. There's also a question from Rosemary Cantwell, who says HIV and AIDS were a major concern 30 years ago, and obviously they're ongoing. How has the world worked through this, especially in relation to other diseases that can be deadly, like coronavirus? How much comes from the animal kingdom or even extraterrestrial viruses? Do you want to say anything about contagion?
That isn't a question for me. That's a statement in itself, and I think it's a wonderful statement. It's complete. I don't think that, that's a wonderful. That's just complete in itself, I think.
Okay. So there's another question that's just been posted. So there are two. I don't know if you want to answer both of them. By Sixto Yuan. First question: how do you balance research, your creative practice, and teaching?
I don't. Higher education in the UK is in meltdown, and it's extractive to the extreme. That's what I have to say about teaching. I love teaching. I genuinely take so much joy in the privilege of talking to students about art every day, but the realities of teaching in this under the current system, extractive and exploitative to the extreme, and underpaid. It's vile. I don't.
And then this is probably have to be our final question. The other part to that was, other than the references you've already given, are there any other research readings that you...
I just gave you a reading list as long as my arm. I talked about Sandilands Nimanis, the poetry of Marwa Hillel, Nisha Ramaya, Banu Kapil. How much more reading do you want me to do? No, actually, Jack Halberstam is someone who has been really useful for me. His most recent book on wildness has been wonderful. And actually, the thing that I'm working on currently is a live performance, which will happen as part of a symposium with Serpentine Ecologies, organized by Kostas Stasnopoulos and Jack Halberstam in July. So yeah, look for that. Actually, there's a really wonderful book called, hold on, give me 1 second. This is the book I'm reading currently. It's called Beyond the Pink Tide by Macarena Gomez Barris, which I think is wonderful. It's about multiple strategies of political dissent in Central and South America. It's really quite an amazing read, and I think she will also be involved in the symposium.
Well, I think that's the end of our time. I honestly can't thank you enough. Not only was that lecture incredibly generous and generative, it was also profoundly, it felt profoundly vulnerable and honest and self-reflexive, and you know, an intense joy and a privilege to listen to. I'm really, really grateful for you sharing your time and your work with us this evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, please do share your thanks in the chat. It's always lovely. Obviously, as we're not in person, we can't hear a round of applause. So it's nice to be able to, it's nice to be able to send a message. Thank you. I found that really special. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really grateful.
Really wonderful doing this. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Well, anyway, thank you and goodbye.
Bye.